So the structure of stories tends to be very formulaic, and most stories can be broken down into very simple elements. And as someone who has a degree in English and is working on getting another degree in English, and also as someone who's been working on a novel for the last 3 years, I'm very familiar with story structure. By the way, if you're wondering why I've been working on a novel for the last 3 years, to make a good novel, it actually takes a lot of time, which is why good authors take a lot of time to write novels. You can look it up. Really bad authors do not take as long. But anyway, I was reflecting on story structure in relation to like failure, because that's August's Media Monday theme is failure. And I was trying to think about what to do, and I understood story structure in relation to failure. There's tons of failure within story elements. And I thought about what my writing professors would always say. They always say that conflict is what makes a story good. You know, a story without any conflict is a boring story. Like if I tell a story about making a ham and cheese sandwich, it's a story. It is a story, but there's no conflict, so it's kind of mediocre at best. Conflict, however, in a long form story, so like a serialized novel, a comic book run, a series of movies, or a movie itself. A movie's technically long form content because most movies these days are like 3 hours. But in long form stories, conflict needs to exist in a different way to be more effective, and it exists through failure. You know, it's not just the arguments and the fights. There needs to be stakes that are relevant, and the relevant stakes usually come with the reality that like the hero will likely fail at some point in the story. So when I was preparing for Media Monday, and I tried to think of a good story to explore failure through, like, you know, which movie or which comic book run has the best example of like when the hero fails deeply, I decided that I should just talk about failure in story structure as a whole, mainly because I'm indecisive and couldn't really choose anything. But also it just gives me a good launching point to talk about story structure in the future. So, anyway, let's talk about heroes failing. So, according to Jessica Brody's textbook, Save the Cat, Write a Novel, a novelist can tell a story through a novel by, you know, making sure they have essentially 15 core story beats, or 15 sections of a story, each with their own place in the narrative and their own stakes, to create a more fluid story, essentially. And one of these story beats, or one of these sections, is called the all is lost moment, which is said to be the lowest point of the novel, of the story. It's when the hero hits rock bottom. And while Save the Cat is a textbook for novelists, I had to read it for one of my English classes. I think it can apply to most forms of story in media, especially those of like books, naturally, anime, manga, serialized comic books, some movies, and you see the all is lost section in most stories, and it is what it sounds like. It's when the character basically loses everything. They've lost all of their progress. They may have lost their identity, they may have lost friends, they may find themselves alone, anything of that nature, any form of major loss. The all is lost section is the most devastating part of a story. This is meant to get the audience, along with the protagonist, to question whether the story can even move forward after this. Most humans in real life will have an all is lost moment, and actually will likely have several. There are several times when you feel like you've hit rock bottom, whether that be financially, socially, economically, academically, so on and so forth. One finds themselves alone with no one, or may find themselves with nothing, or may find themselves with everything materially but nothing spiritually or academically or anything of that nature. You know, that is the rock bottom, the all is lost moment. And, you know, we find ourselves in bad places, and, you know, even if we're trying hard and trying to make the world good, we find ourselves in bad places. And, you know, once you hit rock bottom, I mean, the only way is up, and as corny as that sounds, like, that is the truth. But that's also the truth in story structure. Once you hit the all is lost moment, most writers will only write up. I mean, there's nothing left to write. I mean, some writers, do not have to follow the formulaic method. You can definitely write a story in which the hero hits an all is lost moment and then just doesn't recover. They're just broken for the rest of the story and fundamentally give up. Like, that is possible. Most people don't read stories like that. Most writers don't even write stories like that because some interesting elements in a story like that. But in most cases, a writer, when a character hits the all is lost moment, writes the character growing, right? Because most people, when they hit an all is lost moment, grow. Some people do not. Just like some writers don't write characters that do that, some people hit rock bottom and just stay there forever. And I'm sure we all have met people like that. But growth is kind of natural for most people and most characters once you hit rock bottom. One of the best examples of this in media is in the anime and manga One Piece, which is a super long anime and manga that I'm caught up on, but it's like over 1,000 episodes, over 1,000 chapters of manga. You can consume either or. If you're familiar with anime and manga, you don't have to consume both. But it's really long, essentially, is what I want to say. But in one of the arcs, one of the story arcs called the Marineford arc, which is about 450 episodes in. Skip ahead if you don't want spoilers for One Piece if you're watching them, even though what I'm about to talk about happened like 20 years ago. Maybe it's like 10 years. It happened a long time ago. Anyway, it's probably more like 15 years ago. Spoilers anyway. So One Piece follows the story beats that I've talked about. One of the story beats One Piece hits is the bad guys close in moment, which is where Luffy, the main character of One Piece and the pirate captain of the main crew in One Piece, loses his whole crew. They get teleported away by a villain named Bartholomew Kuma. Kuma teleports them all away. His power is to teleport people. Well, his power is a little more complicated than that, but he teleports all the crew away. So Luffy feels like he loses his crew, which relates to the story beat the bad guy closes in, which is essentially when the bad guys get a major win, essentially. Or the antagonistic forces get a major win of some kind. It usually precedes the all is lost moment. It happens before. It can happen a few story beats before it, or it can happen right before. Save the Cat kind of hints that it usually happens right before, but there's some nuance there with stories as always. And Kuma also teleports Luffy away to a foreign island, essentially scattering the crew across the world. And Luffy goes through another story arc on this island that kind of hits some beats that aren't relevant to the plot. When you have a long form story, beats repeat and shuffle out and repeat and shuffle out constantly. But on this island that Kuma has sent Luffy to, Luffy discovers that his brother Ace has been captured and is scheduled to be executed by the world government. So Luffy decides to break Ace out of prison before he can get executed, which is its own arc where Luffy breaks into prison, experiences a lot of losses. It has several bad guys close in moments because he's way out of his depth. And this is a fantasy anime, so there's lots of fighting, there's lots of like magic. But Luffy almost loses several times, and arguably does lose once or twice in several bad guys close in moments, and almost experiences an all is lost moment, but he keeps going, because with the bad guys close in, you can keep going. The bad guys win, but you're not beaten down, essentially. Eventually, Luffy gets to where Ace was, learns that the government already took Ace to his execution block kind of earlier than expected, but Luffy breaks out a bunch of other prisoners. He's been breaking out prisoners the whole time. And they all escape out of the prison except one. One friend sacrifices himself so Luffy can get away, kind of cementing a bad guy's close-in moment. So Luffy then heads to Marineford. Side note, Marineford is where Ace is set to be executed. Ace is also a pirate similar to Luffy, but Ace is not the leader of his own pirate crew. He's a crew member of an even more famous pirate named Whitebeard. Whitebeard's one of the strongest pirates in the world, and Whitebeard is also planning on saving Ace. And the world government is planning on Whitebeard's attempt to save Ace. So the world government is mobilizing their whole military, called the Marines, or the Navy, depending on translation, but mobilizes the Marines to go to Marineford, which is one of their bases, to essentially stop Ace from being saved and essentially make sure that he's publicly executed, to send a message out to all the pirates of the world. So eventually Whitebeard goes to war with the world government once he reaches Marineford, and Luffy kind of also goes to war with the world government once he gets there. And there's another story beat where Luffy actually saves Ace, and this is the midpoint story beat. The midpoint story beat is where the heroes get a false victory, or a very minor victory that doesn't actually help at all. If you're wondering why I say it's a false victory, it's because the midpoint, which usually precedes the bad guys close in, and usually precedes all is lost, but it doesn't have to. The bad guys close in, midpoint can kind of happen at the same time. In this case, they kind of do. Luffy receives a false victory of saving Ace, and Ace immediately gets killed by one of the strongest forces on the Marine side. And this is a devastating moment for the audience and Luffy, because if you're watching this for the first time, nobody really dies in One Piece until this moment. Like, there's like deaths in backstories and stuff, but nobody dies in the present story's timeline that is important until this moment where Ace is killed on screen, on page, if you're watching anime, reading manga. And Luffy is devastated. He does not move the rest of the fight. He just breaks down and is just basically a non-factor for the rest of the battle. They literally have to carry this man throughout the battle because he cannot bring himself to do anything, because everything is lost. He's lost his crew, a few arcs back. He's now lost his brother, and he can get his crew back. He just doesn't know where they are, but his brother is dead. So Luffy's just done. He drops to the middle of the war. He drops to his knees in the middle of the battlefield and just is done. And almost dies a few times after that. That is the all is lost moment. For Luffy, all was lost in that moment. So the next story beat that happens after the all is lost moment is kind of the what do I do next part of the story. It's not rock bottom itself, but the identity crisis and the sadness that happens after the all is lost moment. For Luffy in One Piece, this is him trying to figure out what he could have done better, and it's him dealing with the loss of his brother Ace, and realizing that he was not strong enough on his own to save Ace, regardless. Luffy was the weakest combatant on the field, besides like the grunts, but every major named character on the battlefield was almost infinitely stronger than Luffy, with the exception of like 5. Out of like 20 named people on that battlefield, Luffy was stronger than like 5 of them. And he realizes to save his crew, to protect his crew, to protect his dreams, he's going to have to become stronger. So he chooses to train for 3 whole years before reuniting his crew. And that's kind of proves what this next story beat is like. There are multiple directions one can go in after hitting rock bottom, after experiencing a devastating loss. Some people give up for a short time within stories. Others push forward and like do training like Luffy does, and go about things differently. Other heroes have no choice but to stop. So like if a protagonist finds themselves in prison, they can't really exactly move forward in a traditional sense. They're captured. Or if a protagonist finds themselves gravely injured or paralyzed or in a coma, their next steps look completely different. This story beat is called The Dark Night of the Soul. It's a commonly known story beat amongst English majors, but even outside of that, like psychologists kind of also are vaguely aware of the concept, especially if you study psychoanalytics of like Sigmund Freud, Carl Jung, Joseph Campbell, those people. The concept of the Dark Night of the Soul comes from a Christian mystic called Saint John of the Cross, who wrote a poem about the soul's union with God called The Dark Night of the Soul. Basically, he's writing about the soul's journey, which is a common thing to do amongst Christian mystics, especially at that time. And John of the Cross often talks about love and how important love is for faith, stating that in the evening of life, you will be judged on love alone. That's essentially his whole ideas about life wrapped up in a small ball. Something so beautiful, that quote's really beautiful, and it's interesting because, I'm a Christian, I say that a lot, but like, a lot of Christians do not care about love, and here's St. John, like, at the end of your life, people are going to evaluate how much of a loving person you were. That's essentially all that really matters. And people don't think about that, especially like Christians don't think about that as they're yelling at trans people for using the bathroom or whatever. St. John's over here like, what are you doing? Anywho, the poem The Dark Night of the Soul kind of reads as the follow. I'm going to read it out. I'm going to read the Wikipedia translation of it because I don't have any other translation. The two books I have about saints and the writings of saints have St. John of the Cross in them, but they reference literally every other work and quote all his other works except the work that I want for this. So I'm forced to read the Wikipedia translation because I don't have another translation, and I'm sure I can find one, but I'm just gonna deal with what I have to deal with. Anyway, here's the poem. On a dark night, kindled in love with yearnings, O happy chance, I went forth without being observed, my house being now at rest, in darkness and secure, by the secret ladder disguised. O happy chance, in darkness and in concealment, my house now being at rest, in the happy night, in secret, when none saw me, nor I beheld aught, without light or guide, save that which burned in my heart. This light guided me more surely than the light of noonday, to the place where he, well I know who, was awaiting me, a place where none appeared. O night that guided me, O night more lovely than the dawn, O night that joined, beloved with lover, lover transformed in the beloved, upon my flowery breast, kept wholly for himself alone. There he stayed sleeping, and I caressed him, and the fanning of the cedars made a breeze. The breeze blew from the turret as I parted his locks. With his gentle hand he wounded my neck, and caused all my senses to be suspended. I remained lost in oblivion, my face reclined on the beloved. All ceased, and I abandoned myself, leaving my cares forgotten among the lilies. So the darkness within the poem is meant to reflect God, and the poem's theme is kind of like releasing your own willpower to allow, the divine will to like do its thing. Essentially, don't resist what happens, and admit like a level of helplessness to move forward in like union with God. That's essentially what John of the Cross means. The poem's a little odd. Well, the poem's very odd, actually. But you could tell that St. John of the Cross deeply believed that like love was a very important aspect of a relationship with God, which is why the poem has some interesting word choices that are very beautiful but very, very odd. So ultimately, The Dark Night of the Soul is a step toward God through love despite suffering that surrounds it. Later, Joseph Campbell, a scholar of mythology, and my scholarly arch nemesis. There are a few scholars I dislike as much as Joseph Campbell. Anyway, Joseph Campbell will later apply the concept of the Dark Night of the Soul to stories, which is how we come full circle. So Joseph Campbell, the way I defined the Dark Night of the Soul earlier, is essentially what Joseph Campbell argues is the Dark Night of the Soul. It's the belief that the dark night of the soul is the moment in which, the character moves towards growth. It's where everything has been lost, and now the character must, understand something greater. The Dark Night of the Soul, happens in everyone's life, similar to the all is lost moment. And in most stories, the Dark Night of the Soul is very complex, and very complex stories often have the Dark Night of the Soul. It's not required, but it often happens. There are, again, stories in which you don't have to have a dark night of the soul. The character can wallow at rock bottom, or there's some stories where the character never really even hits rock bottom. Most people don't read those stories, though. But there's something, helpful and complex about the concept of the dark night of the soul. And it's important to understand that in most stories, the hero has to escape rock bottom, or at least evaluate why the hero is at rock bottom to move forward in the story. That is essentially the crux of the Dark Night of the Soul. So I'm hoping this video will be shorter for Monday, aka today, because I just want this to be a launching off point for future discussions about story structure on my channel. However, I also want this to be used at the start of a conversation that I want the audience to both have with and without me. As I'm sure you've realized, the concept of failure in story structure is super linked with spirituality and religion. In story structure, once all is lost, the dark night of the soul causes the hero to move towards some greater truth or some greater aspect of the self, or, move towards something greater, And our real lives are kind of the same. Again, we experience a lot of the all is lost moments and often experience rock bottom, and therefore we often experience a lot of dark night of the soul moments, or these dark nights that lead us to grow spiritually. And even if you're not religious, spiritual is kind of a complicated concept. Relates to metaphysics, which is a branch of philosophy that essentially just means the extra concepts of reality, the abstract, the love, the soul, those aspects that you don't have to believe in higher divine forces to believe in. Higher divine forces themselves are also a concept of metaphysics, but that's neither here nor there. But when I hit rock bottom about 2 years ago, I found myself re-exploring what pillars held up my life, and what pillars I wanted to keep, and what pillars I wanted to destroy, and what pillars I wanted to build. And I, similar to St. John of the Cross, moved towards like love and empathy. That's why his statement of, at the end of your life, in the evening of life, he says, you'll be judged by, how you loved, essentially. And I, during this crisis, was destroying pillars that I already had found to be faulty, like they were already crumbling and crashing. I was just kind of finishing the job, and I'm still finishing the job. And these were pillars like, faith in capitalism. I'm not a capitalist. I'm very much anti-capitalism, internal patriarchy, homophobia, transphobia, all of those pillars, that I had already been deconstructing for like the last 10 years, but especially, these last 2 years. And it was during this time, that I had hit rock bottom, like kind of spiritually and socially and much more, that, I started to explore more about my gender and gender identity, and started to realize that, I'm more so identify as non-binary at this point in my life. And honestly, I'll probably move in a different direction in the future, but I would have never had that without that all is lost moment. I also started to understand, what I wanted from the world, and what I want to, assist the world in like creating, And I'm sure you've had similar moments, like Luffy from One Piece. I'm sure at some point you lost so much you had to take time to grow just so you can accept the good things you had left. I'm sure that many of you, like St. John of the Cross, moved towards love and empathy after hitting rock bottom in an attempt to make sure the people around you don't hit rock bottom in the same way that you did. You see, I didn't expect this video to be spiritual or religious or anything like that. I didn't expect it to be metaphysical at all, I thought this would all be like the aesthetics, the branch of philosophy that's all about value and value judgment, because failure and success are value judgments. But this video is more metaphysical than all those other things, really, because it deals, the concept of the dark night of the soul is metaphysical in nature, even though it is just applied to story structure these days. Most people don't read St. John's poem, but as someone who studies English and religion, it's not always my attempt to make a video religious in nature, to explore the religious nuance of something, or see how the two combine. But, as someone who studies English religion and philosophy, it just kind of happens. It's just kind of how I'm wired, and also the things I tend to talk about just often tend to just loop back around. However, the nature of story structure is so intertwined with how we as people view life, and therefore it often reflects spirituality as well as how we view growth and progress. Hitting rock bottom is hard. Losing everything is hard. The dark night of the soul is a hard period to have, because you're rebuilding pillars you thought were important. You're picking up the pieces to build, stronger pillars in your life to hold up your life in a better place than it once was, But what's so good about the next story beat, if you follow the Save the Cat story beats, is like this aha moment is considered the next story beat. It's when you realize what you need to do next, and you're carried by the growth of your soul happening in the dark night to like hit this aha moment. And I'll say all of this to say that if you feel like you're at rock bottom, or you're trying to piece yourself together, or piece your soul back together during this dark night period, just know it's not easy, but once you figure it out, you'll move towards some level of peace, some level of wholeness. For St. John of the Cross, this move towards wholeness was moving towards God and love and empathy. But for you, it can be completely different. You can move towards completely different things. Either way, the bottom, rock bottom forces you to move towards wholeness after breaking off parts of us that may have been holding us back in a sense. And the parts that broke off can possibly be rebuilt. If they were good parts, or maybe they shouldn't be rebuilt. It very much depends on your situation. This is up to you to decide and figure out, but just know that you will become whole most of the time. And remember, like St. John of the Cross said, at the end of your life, you'll be judged by love alone, essentially. Even if you're not religious, St. John's thinking about, mostly how God will judge you. But, even if you're not religious, the actions, your lasting actions are usually actions done against or for other people, actions rooted in love. If you do good things for other people, actions rooted in love and empathy, you'll be well remembered. If you do not do good things for other people, people will not remember you well. You will be judged by love, essentially. You're judged by your actions, but actions are based off value judgments, which is axiology, which is a level of like love, So once you hit rock bottom and choose to heal and become whole, like the Dark Knight calls you to, and don't move forward in brokenness, you'll be judged by essentially the good actions you'll likely have. Some people will definitely move in brokenness. Some people will definitely hit rock bottom and just wallow there forever. And you don't want to be that person, because hurt people. And someone who's at rock bottom, being at rock bottom is not bad, but someone who's willingly still at rock bottom will hurt people very, very, very negatively. And, you want to think about like how to not be that. How to reevaluate the pillars you have to build a stronger, more loving life, if that makes sense. Essentially, that's what I am taking away from the concept of all is lost in the dark night of the soul, that like sits under story structure as a whole. And just as we have live stories, we have a dark night of the soul and an all is lost moment in which we are being called to like reflect on how to go forward. If you can't tell, this video was kind of a major yap session. I always have a script for these videos, and I mostly read from the script. I improvise a little bit, which is probably why you see me looking over a lot, but I'm not always reading it word for word. But why I'd say it's a yap session is because the script is kind of raw and vulnerable in many ways, and I'm trying to fully expound upon how I really feel, and it's how I feel right now. Like, I feel like I'm in the dark night of the soul right now, and I feel like I've been in it for the last 2 years. And like I said, I hit rock bottom about 2 years ago, and I've been, rethinking and rebuilding and destroying various pillars that have held up my life up to this point. Some of them are religious. I've destroyed a lot of religious pillars. Some are social. Some are, expectations of others. And I just am afraid of everything that comes next. But that's kind of natural. Like I'm afraid of, building the wrong pillars. Because like most people raised in the Western world, I've built up, like I said earlier, pillars that build Western society. I've built up those pillars in my own life. These are like patriarchy, white supremacy, homophobia, transphobia, general bigotry, a unnatural acceptance of capitalism as though capitalism is just a natural system. That's neither here nor there. This is not a economic video or a political video, even though all my videos are political in a sense, because you can't really escape politics. Politics are applied philosophy. Anyway, again, neither here nor there. But I've been feeling like this brokenness, for a while, but, that's because I hit rock bottom and, like, trying to understand how I want to go forward, and, I like what St. John of the Cross said, I want to move forward love and empathy, that's one of my big things, and, I always want to encourage people who watch my videos to be very empathetic to the people around them, to make real change. But, I am afraid of moving further in brokenness, because I think that's what a lot of people do. They hit rock bottom, they realize that the pillars of, like, white supremacy and patriarchy and homophobia aren't good pillars. They do not help you very much. And when those pillars start to shatter and they break, people either attempt to rebuild those exact pillars, try and do claim that no, they are correct, you just need to do this and this, or that, like, the pillar of patriarchy is correct, it's this pillar of feminism that people have made that makes patriarchy work incorrectly. It's like, no, patriarchy is fully working as intended, that's why you are suffering, that's why you're so hard on yourself as a man or as a woman, blah blah blah. Or other people try to move in the brokenness, they become nihilistic. Yeah, patriarchy, they'll be like, yeah, patriarchy is awful. So what? I'm awful too, and I will be awful. And that's where you get a lot of these weird dynamics between people. And, I'm hoping with this Media Monday, to, like, speak to myself in a way to make sure, that I'm reevaluating things correctly, and that I'm on, and, like, kind of pat myself on the back in the sense that, like, I hope I am on the right path, if that makes sense. And I hope you've all enjoyed the Media Monday too. I think this is one of my favorite concepts I've talked about so far, even though it's a basic generic concept that many people outside of just English majors know about. But I've processed a lot in my life since I first learned about a lot of these concepts, so it's very interesting to, like, revisit them with a different lens, But anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. Hopefully Philosophy Fridays, the first one, will be out Friday. I've had a lot going on in my personal life, but hopefully it'll be out Friday. I have plans to start a Substack. For those who don't know, Substack's like a social media platform that's dedicated for writers and journalists and stuff. It's very, very writing focused. I want to start pushing and publishing short stories on there, and some, like, just written personal essays and stuff that I think will be good to put out there, because I'm a writer. I'm making YouTube videos, but, like, in my heart of hearts, like, I want to write. So be on the lookout for that in the future. I'll advertise it on here at some point. Anyway, give thoughts and feedbacks in the comments, and I do want to hear about your dark night of the soul moments, or your rock bottom, your all is lost moments, if you're willing to share. But thank you for watching, and remember to be kind to yourself and others.